Hello and welcome to Lecture 12 in History 361, African American History to 1877 at New Mexico State University. I am Professor Bronstein, and today I'll be talking about the lives of Black people in the North before the Civil War, with particular focus on the demography, the economic picture, the mutual self-help, and all kinds of activist, literary, and abolitionist movements. By 1830, slavery existed almost exclusively in the South. New Jersey was the only northern state that had any significant number of slaves. There were 2,254 African Americans in slavery in New Jersey in 1830. By 1850, that number had decreased to 236. Slavery was quickly becoming a distant memory in the North. However, anti-Black prejudice was still prevalent in northern states. French writer Alexis de Tocqueville, who visited the United States and wrote a couple of volumes of his observations, noted in 1831 that, quote, "The prejudice of race appears to be stronger in the states that have abolished slavery than in those where it still exists. And nowhere is it so intolerant as in those states where servitude has never been known." Racial prejudice in the North was intensified because whites could not justify blacks' lower status without slavery, and so they instituted segregation laws and exclusions to enforce black submission. Black laws in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Missouri discouraged or prohibited free blacks from settling in those states. By law and custom, whites restricted blacks' access to jobs and public institutions. The legal system also discriminated against free blacks. Law enforcement didn't protect black people. They were imprisoned at a higher rate than whites because they were believed to be predisposed to criminal behavior, and they were excluded from juries and could not function as witnesses in court. It actually wasn't until the 1850s that African Americans were allowed to serve on any juries, and then only in Massachusetts. Emerging social scientific studies reinforced the view that African Americans were inferior. Dr. Samuel G. Morton of Philadelphia collected human skulls from all over the world and used a research technique called craniology that involved measuring skulls to conclude that whites' larger skulls were indicative of higher brain capacity and smaller African skulls reflected an inferior brain capacity. Morton published his findings in Crania Americana in 1839. And you can see I have reproduced a page of that awful racist tract. As the 19th century wore on, these same arguments will be used by European powers to justify the colonization of additional areas of the world, including Africa and Asia, and in the United States to justify depriving Native Americans of their land. And I should just note that this is certainly a misuse of science. There was no relationship between measuring crania and finding out anything about intelligence, and so this was really a kind of mismeasure of man, to quote from the title of a book on that topic. White slaveholders used race-based studies conducted by leading scholars in Europe and America to justify slavery. They used these ideas to feed their suspicions that blacks were inferior, and others championed the idea that blacks should be colonized outside the United States to rid the nation of free black people. But the American Colonization Society's efforts to promote the emigration of free blacks to Liberia largely failed because, as I've noted before, most free blacks viewed the United States as their home. For whites, the 1830s marked the so-called era of the common man. White men gained universal voting rights during this period, but the flip side of that, and it was completely related, was that African American men lost their voting rights. Pennsylvania disenfranchised black men in 1837, and every state that joined the nation after 1819, except for Maine, followed suit. By 1860, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island were the only states that allowed free blacks to vote, and blacks made up only 6% of the population in these 5 states. Because they didn't have the right to vote elsewhere, African Americans were effectively barred from political life and did not have political representation. African Americans were also victims of economic discrimination. They competed for the lowest jobs with working class whites and new immigrants. And as a result of this perceived competition, they were the targets of a hostility that often flared into violence. Racially motivated riots were common in the North, as white mobs frequently attacked black neighborhoods, destroying blacks' property and sometimes even taking black lives. A series of riots in Cincinnati highlights the violence that free blacks experienced. Cincinnati, Ohio was a popular destination for newly emancipated blacks and fugitive slaves. In June 1829, whites in the city were so alarmed by the growing black population that officials announced plans for renewed enforcement of the state's black laws. White mobs attacked the city's blacks, and some 200 fled to Canada and established a settlement called Wilberforce, after the British abolitionist William Wilberforce, who led anti-slavery measures in Britain's colonies. In 1836, white mobs in Cincinnati destroyed the print shop that produced an abolitionist newspaper and moved on to destroy black houses and churches. In 1841, battles between unemployed black and white dock workers erupted, and police and militia had to quell the conflict. Nor was Cincinnati the only place where this happened. Anti-black riots erupted in New York, Boston, Providence, Rhode Island, and especially Philadelphia, which experienced riots in 1820, 29, 34, 35, 38, 42, and 49. During the 1834 riot, both poor and prosperous black people were attacked. Many died and hundreds fled the city. Roving white mobs vandalized the African Presbyterian Church, devastated a black Methodist church, and attacked white supporters of black rights. The 1838 riot involved a group of whites that attacked an abolitionist meeting in Philadelphia's Pennsylvania Hall. In 1837, pro-slavery mobs in Alton, Illinois, threw the printing presses of an abolitionist newspaper into the Mississippi River, burned the print shop, and murdered the editor, Elijah P. Lovejoy. African Americans were not the only group that experienced discrimination. However, they were at the bottom of a social system that featured discrimination all the way down. During the 1840s and 1850s, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, quote, know-nothings won political offices in England, New England, New York, and Pennsylvania. They were also called the American Party. They were called the Know-Nothing Party because when they were arrested or questioned about their political beliefs, they would say, "We know nothing." So the era of the common man was also an era of intense xenophobia that defined the United States as being only open to Anglo-Saxon Protestants. White immigrants joined the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party at this time was the party of anti-black sentiment. And it was particularly severe among the immigrant Irish, who were portrayed also as something less than white, at least in the 2 decades of their greatest amount of immigration, the 1840s and 1850s. The black population in the North grew as a result of natural increase, the flow of migrants from the southern states, and the arrival of fugitive slaves. In 1860, half of the nation's free black population lived in northern cities. So that's, as you see here on the slide, a total population of 226,152 people. 2,261 African Americans lived in Boston, 12,472 in New York, and 22,185 in Philadelphia. Newer cities in the West, such as Pittsburgh and St. Louis, also had large black populations. Black neighborhoods in northern cities were close to, but mostly separate from, white neighborhoods. Black neighborhoods were densely populated, and some neighborhoods were racially diverse. For example, New York City's Five Points district, where African Americans lived alongside poor whites. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, it takes place in the Five Points district. Some affluent blacks lived in white areas, but white neighborhoods were generally closed to blacks. Black neighborhoods suffered poor sanitation and lacked public services and clean streets. Black economic activities and earning potential were undercut by anti-black sentiments during the 1830s. The only jobs open to African Americans were for unskilled laborers and offered low wages. Black workers were offered seasonal work marked by periods of unemployment. Between 1820 and 1860, the percentage of employed black men dropped, and those jobs went to native-born whites and white immigrants. Among other factors, life chances in the black community were determined in part by gender. Black men had shorter life expectancies than black women, as they suffered from diseases associated with being overworked and poor. Black women worked as domestic servants, and they also worked as street vendors. There were more black widows than widowers in Philadelphia, Boston, and Cincinnati, and female-headed black households were generally poorer than dual-headed black households. One of the only ways to kind of pull yourself out of poverty between 1830 and 1860 as an African American was to open a small business. Philadelphia's James Forten, a second-generation free black man, who I've mentioned before and you've read a segment of his writing, began a profitable sail-making business in the early 1800s. He was able to educate his daughters and granddaughters, who in turn worked in uplift and abolitionist organizations. Barred from resources, jobs, and opportunities, black people in the North looked to each other for support and espoused a self-improvement philosophy, fostering the idea that the individual, rather than external circumstances, dictated his or her own destiny. By advocating this belief, they were really just reflecting the beliefs of the larger society, which said, you're poor because you're immoral, not because there is structural unemployment, not because there's discrimination. People actually bought into this. Martin Delany, a black journalist, doctor, and writer who is depicted here, observed in 1852, quote, "Our elevation must be the result of self-efforts and a work of our own hands. No other human power can accomplish it. If we but determine it shall be so, it will be so." So how did people do this? Well, they formed mutual aid societies, independent black churches, and black schools. They formed lodges and fraternities, women's auxiliaries, and female benevolent societies. By 1840, there were more than 60 black support organizations in Philadelphia alone. Black orphanages, such as the Colored Orphan Asylum established by white Quaker women in New York in 1836, cared for black children whose parents had died or could not support them. James McCune Smith, a black doctor who had received his medical training in Scotland, was appointed medical director of the orphanage in 1846. Independent black churches, like Philadelphia's Mother Bethel AME Church, provided critical support to black communities in the North, and religious groups banded together. So white Quakers and abolitionists helped free blacks in northern cities form private schools. In 1832, Prudence Crandall, a young Quaker teacher in Canterbury, Connecticut, admitted an African-American girl to her school, and when this caused white parents to withdraw their children, she closed the school and then reopened it for black girls only. Black schools staffed by black teachers had high enrollment rates. By the 1830s, more than 1,400 students were enrolled in New York's African Free School, but they were short on books and supplies. Eventually, court challenges to discrimination resulted in some public schools being open to blacks. Moreover, African Americans in Cincinnati opened their own community-based high school, and the city later built a black public high school. This emphasis on education meant that teacher training became the focus of most secondary institutions that served African Americans. The Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia and Charles Avery's Allegheny Institute near Pittsburgh focused on training black teachers. The Ashman Institute, later renamed Lincoln University, and Wilberforce University opened in the 1850s and were focused on educating African Americans in the arts and sciences. Teaching attracted the brightest and most talented black women because it was one of the few professions open to women at the time. For example, Sarah Mapps Douglas, a daughter of middle-class black parents who was educated by private tutors, and she is depicted there at right, opened a high school for black girls that provided training in science, and in 1853 she took over the girls' department of the Institute for Colored Youth. After taking classes at the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania and Penn Medical University in the 1850s, she began offering medical education classes to women at her home. Black women leaders were generally deeply religious and promoted virtuous living. They embraced the idea that women were guardians of the home and railed against alcohol abuse, called for an end to prostitution, and were at the forefront of social reform within the black community. Maria Stewart, the first African-American woman to speak in front of a mixed audience of men and women, was influenced by David Walker, although she rejected his call for violence. She promoted the moral reform of the black community, saying that black intellectual and moral education would decrease white prejudice. The emphasis on respectability even extended to clothing choices. Lewis Woodson, the Pittsburgh AME minister and educator, believed that posture and dress reflected inner character, writing in the Colored American, quote, "Everyone must agree that the moral effect of mean dress is to degrade us in our own eyes and in the eyes of all who behold us." So again, just to reiterate, there was this real emphasis on respectability and on uplift of the community itself, and much less emphasis on combating racism in the white community. In 1830, the first in a series of gatherings that constituted the, quote, Black Convention movement took place in Philadelphia at the Mother Bethel AME Church. Bishop Richard Allen called together black clergy and other leaders to meet about the issues that affected their communities. 40 black clergy responded from 9 states, including the slave states of Delaware, Virginia, and Maryland. They discussed and debated measures that should be taken to advance civil rights for free blacks. The group advocated educational opportunities, promoted economic opportunities like savings banks and cooperative economic business plans, and emphasized moral and Christian education. These conventions spread in the 1840s to Cleveland, New York, and Rochester and Troy in upstate New York. In 1843, 2 former slaves spoke at the convention in Buffalo. Henry Highland Garnett, minister of the Liberty Street Presbyterian Church in Troy, called openly for a slave rebellion, but Frederick Douglass, a lecturer on the abolitionist circuit, advocated a more tempered course of action. Black conventions unified African Americans as a distinct people and provided an alternative black political movement that powerfully declared, in the words of an 1848 convention in Cleveland, quote, "We are as a people chained together. We are one people, one in general complexion, one in a common degradation, one in popular estimation. As one rises, all must rise, and as one falls, all must fall." The black press also emerged as an important component of the growing network of black leaders and institutions. In 1827, John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish began publishing Freedom's Journal, the nation's first black newspaper. The paper lasted only 2 years, but in 1829, Cornish began publishing another paper, The Rights of All. However, this also ceased publication shortly after its first issue. Most black newspapers only survived with the support and help of wealthy white patrons, but more than 40 black papers emerged between 1830 and 1860, no matter how briefly, discussing things like black economic, educational, and political opportunities. We really don't know what the circulation figures would have been for any of these papers, but what we do know is that each newspaper was recycled many times through many hands. Often newspapers were also left in coffee shops and in saloons for people to read. So we can safely assume that each copy of the newspaper was read many times. Frederick Douglass's newspaper, the North Star, was the most influential black newspaper during the period. Launched in 1847, the North Star attacked slavery and attracted black and white readers alike. The paper featured contributions from well-known writers like James McCune Smith, who in 1855 argued for race pride, quote, "We must learn to love, respect, and glory in our Negro nature." The North Star continued publication in one form or another until 1863. There was also a growing black activism in this period, most of it structured around seeking the abolition of slavery, but not all. Frederick Douglass was one of the best-known activists of his era, and I've mentioned him before. He escaped slavery in 1838 and settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he worked as a day laborer. He attended an anti-slavery meeting in Nantucket in 1841 and agreed to speak about his captivity. The audience was astounded by his presentation, and later he was encouraged by the prominent white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison to pursue lecturing as a career path. Douglass published his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, in 1845. It sold more than 30,000 copies within 5 years. In 1855, he revised and expanded this book into My Bondage and My Freedom. And the books were largely addressed at white audiences, intending to raise their awareness about the horrors of slavery. Nor was Frederick Douglass the only black abolitionist who went around speaking. William Wells Brown, Henry Box Brown, the man who had himself shut up in a box and mailed to the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society, Henry Bibb and Harriet Jacobs followed in Douglass's footsteps and published accounts of their lives as slaves. Jacobs' narrative added the hidden dimension of sexual violence to the list of abuses that slaves endured, as you guys know. Sojourner Truth, former Isabella Baumfree, an ex-slave from New York who achieved freedom and won her son's freedom in court, transformed herself into a lecturer, spiritualist, and preacher. In 1847, Truth's audiences packed Boston's Faneuil Hall. For Truth, abolition was a spiritual issue, but she also argued for women's rights. She didn't present herself as a respectable middle-class reformer who argued for abolition and equality in the abstract. Rather, she candidly engaged her audiences with her experiences as a slave. During an 1858 speech in Indiana, some audience members insisted that a woman could not speak so forcefully and demanded that Truth bare her breast to prove that she was a woman, and she did. The period also saw an outpouring of African American literature that could easily be interpreted as a renaissance. Jarena Lee, a member of Mother Bethel AME Church, wrote a spiritual autobiography in 1836 about being a female preacher in a male-dominated world. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper published a volume of poetry in 1854 that included The Slave Mother. Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany published novels about slave insurrections. William Wells Brown published the novel Clotel in 1853, which featured a new character type called, quote, the tragic mulatta. Harriet Wilson wrote about prejudice in the North. James W.C. Pennington wrote a slave narrative and a black history of the United States, etc., etc. Activist writing during this period showed less deference to whites than did the writings of the post-revolutionary period. So you'll recall, for example, Phyllis Wheatley. Now people are becoming more self-efficacious, more activist, and writing in a more confrontational style. Finally, under the rubric of activism here, Elizabeth Jennings, a teacher in New York City's black public schools, took a stand against racism in the 1850s by suing the Third Avenue Railroad for refusing to let her ride a streetcar because there were separate cars for blacks. The court ruled in favor of Jennings' discrimination suit, and as a result, the Third Avenue Railroad stopped segregating its cars. Jennings' case signaled to free blacks that they could use the courts to fight for equality. Similarly, Benjamin Roberts sued the city of Boston in 1848 for mandating that his daughter attend an all-black school. Roberts was represented by Robert Morris, one of the nation's first black lawyers, and Charles Sumner, who later became a U.S. Senator. The court upheld the city's segregated school policy, but the case raised questions and arguments that the state would ultimately resolve by being the first state to prohibit racial segregation of public schools in 1855. Okay, so it took 7 years for these arguments to finally pay off in school desegregation in Massachusetts, but it did in fact happen. And at left there you have a photograph of Elizabeth Jennings, who sued about the streetcar segregation. Some black abolitionists were born free and others had been born slaves. Some worked with white abolitionists and others rejected them. Yet black abolitionists were critical to the development of the abolitionist movement as a whole. In the 1830s, abolitionists moved away from gradual emancipation, African colonization, and schemes that offered to pay slaveholders to free slaves. A new wave of abolitionists argued that slavery was immoral and demanded that slavery be ended immediately, and they championed political action to make their demand a reality. I should say a lot of this new energy behind abolitionism was also caused by the Second Great Awakening, the big religious revival that started in the United States and picked up steam in the 1820s and 1830s. William Lloyd Garrison led the moral suasion wing of the abolitionists, and the wealthy brothers Arthur and Lewis Tappan led the political action wing. The three men founded the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. 63 delegates from 11 states, including 3 African Americans, attended the first meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and black abolitionists were among those who agreed with William Lloyd Garrison that people had to be convinced that slavery was a great national sin, and that was going to spur on abolitionism. In 1831, Garrison began publishing The Liberator, the most famous abolitionist paper of the era. Black activists helped to make the paper successful. James Forten, Maria Stewart, and Frederick Douglass wrote articles for the paper, and Forten signed up subscribers. Garrison wrote articles for The Liberator in which he insisted that to end slavery, white Americans' hearts, and not just American laws, had to change. He called for other reforms, including women's rights, prison reform, and temperance. So one of the things that's quite interesting here is how it was the white abolitionists who were really willing to call out white people for their racism. The Tappan brothers attacked the Constitution for being a pro-slavery document. Their support for the anti-slavery wing of the Whig Party helped to strengthen their impact. The brothers were also involved in 2 anti-slavery parties, the Liberty Party, founded in 1840, and the Free Soil Party, founded in 1848. In terms of women's involvement, in 1833, Lucretia Mott, a grandmother, a Quaker, the mother of many, many children, founded the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. This society included black activists such as Grace Douglas and the women of the Forten family. These women signed petitions, distributed literature, raised money, and supported fugitive slaves. Women's participation in the abolitionist movement was critical, and it really helped to empower women. But when William Lloyd Garrison appointed a woman to the executive board of his organization, the organization split in 2. As a result of the split, the Tappan brothers and a group of black ministers formed the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, which was committed to only male leadership at the top levels. Some of the white women who had been active in the abolitionist movement were so scandalized by being excluded from leadership that they went on to form a movement for women's rights, which held the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. So the activism of African Americans and activism about issues that concerned African Americans were both crucial to the formation of not only the abolitionist movement, not only this literary renaissance and challenges to segregation, but also the beginnings of the women's rights movement. Okay, that is it, and I will see you in the comments.